Welcome to another episode of the Data Revolution podcast. Today, my guest is Ben Harris Rojas, and he and I are going to have a bit of a chat. Welcome, Ben, and would you like to introduce yourself and tell us what we're going to have a chat about?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Kate. So my name is Ben Harris Rojas. An associate professor in public health and health service management at the University of New South Wales. A lot of my stuff is about, research about how to make bits and pieces of health systems work better together, integrate a bit better. And I do a fair bit of teaching of master's level students and so on. So also a bit of an online dickhead, so that's probably how we crossed paths originally. So
We met on Twitter in the olden days when it was still good.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Probably going back to like 2008 or something like that. So, really badging ourselves as geriatrics there. So I guess, in the context of today, some of the things I'm interested in is how do we grapple in terms of our teaching, particularly teaching people who have already, done their first degree or whatever, they're out there in the world trying to do stuff. How do we embed a bit of engagement with AI in a sensible way into kind of the mechanics of teaching? So that's where a lot of my headspace about AI is at the moment. But I'm happy to chat about anything, because we have known each other for a long time. We can range from here, there to everywhere.
Well, it's one of the things that I've been talking to a lot of people about and thinking a lot about is like, how do we, now that AI is here and we can do a lot of stuff with it, how do we work out what nugget of knowledge we need to pass on to the next generation? And then how do we assess that they actually know that? And that seems to me to be the big challenge that we have as educators nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly. And so I think it is that. And it's also, thinking about how do we get people to that point where they can engage with it in those sort of more critical terms? Because we often hear people say, oh, we need to be critical and ethical users. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And one of the things that I've sort of increasingly come around to is the idea that, the human role in a lot of this ends up being validation and interpretation, which sounds like, that's a bit perfunctory or whatever. But, actually validation, I've come to realize, is actually kind of a higher order skill than creating something in a way. You're actually being asked to do something that's sort of harder than the act of creation, because through creation, you sort of, you learn about the process, the insights and so on. So if you're validating or sort of checking what an AI is spitting out or, LLMs, other forms of AI, you actually need to know not just how to do it, but also how to check it. And it is interesting because in a lot of our educational ways of thinking, we've got this idea that, people have probably heard like that phrase, watch one, do one, teach one. The idea that you start out by like trying to understand and observe something, then, doing it, maybe synthesizing, replicating is sort of the next level of teaching and then of learning, and then teaching is sort of the pinnacle. But, it's not actually necessarily explaining, synthesizing, teaching that's the hardest. It's often validating as a higher order skill again. So to say to people, use AI, you're actually saying you need to get to this highest level of sort of educational sort of attainment without much sense of how we're going to get there. So I think that's the really hard part, I find.
It's really funny. As part of my PhD, I've just incorporated entrepreneurship into it. And I know nothing. I've been an entrepreneur, but I don't know anything about the academic study and discipline of entrepreneurship. So I'm starting from zero with that. I'm doing all this reading and I'm like, just while you were talking, thinking, how would I validate anything in that space? Because I don't have the knowledge or the scaffolding to think about it. So I'm gathering that knowledge as fast as I can, but literally starting from zero on it.
Well, exactly. And oddly, we are all sort of collectively starting from zero at the moment because we're trying to figure out, what would be the kind of foundational understanding or exposure that would be meaningful in this context. How do you then apply it in the sort of middle stages of learning or mastery? And then how do we get to that, critical evaluation? And at the moment, because we're having to respond in real time, we haven't necessarily got the, ways of thinking about it to actually get to that more, scaffolded or progressed ways of thinking about how we learn and teach it. So that's been a real challenge. I was reflecting the other day, teaching my new batch of students for this year. So I teach a course with quite a large bunch of online postgrad students. So it's about 400 students all across the country and in other countries as well. 3 years ago when I was starting the course, I said to them, I'd heard, just a few months before about, ChatGPT launching. I'd seen a little bit about the earlier transformer models making some really crazy looking sort of artwork and so on. So it was only 3 years ago that they launched ChatGPT formally. And I remember saying to the class, maybe have a think about the best way to use this. I wouldn't necessarily trust its outputs and so on. And, out of a class of 400, only 2 had even heard of it back then. So it is really instructive to just remind ourselves that how much this has changed in terms of application quite quickly. So I think that's the thing that's really, we're playing catch up to sort of adoption in some ways. And so, from my perspective, what I've tried to do in that course is I've said, well, what would it look like if instead of banning use, which was really like, again, it's easy to forget that that was just the universal response was banning use. I remember like
Mm.
New York City public schools blocked, the domains of every, AI they could think of. Sciences Po was a university in France has banned it as well. And then, rapidly had to sort of wind that back basically because, basically our tension in all forms of learning is sort of like, how can we ensure learning, that people are learning some of the things we're saying they are. And this idea that also at the other sort of end is we need to know how to use and engage AI. So there's sort of these competing discourses that are really hard to sort of reconcile. So what I've done is said, okay, well, how about instead of banning it, we require use of it in terms of our postgrad sort of study and so on. So that itself is not necessarily so sort of earth shattering and so on. But I think, what was really interesting in doing this activity and saying that, for assess tasks, what I want you to do is use AI. Yes, we'll look at the outputs, but mostly we want to sort of reflect on your ability to critically appraise and validate the sort of the output and get to that higher order of thinking. So it was kind of like it's been a bit of a mixed success. So, but that's the way I've chosen to respond to this tension instead of pretending the tension doesn't exist, to sort of steer into it and say, how do we actually get to that point of a more critical use of it? And underpinning that critical perspective is not just how to use it well, but also what are the ethical sort of considerations? What's it missing out? Whose perspectives get hard baked into the models as well. Yeah, so it's been interesting. And I can't say it's been a total success actually as well. It's been an interesting
I'm
sort of
really
learning
interested
experience for me.
in that because, like at UTS, for the high degree research program, they're trying to get us to use AI, but to think critically about it. But I often wonder, like, for people who don't have the requisite knowledge, how can they legitimately do that, and how can they engage with the material? Like, and I'm going through that same process now because I've just added
Yeah.
entrepreneurship to my scope. So it's a really interesting problem. Like,
And
I've
it is
just gone back
critical,
to, like,
yeah.
undergrad readings and stuff. I went to Claude and I said, "Give
Yeah.
me an undergraduate reading program for this," and, I'm reading the articles. But a lot of kids don't read anything. Like, nowadays, people don't read anything. So they just
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah.
AI to summarize it, so they're not engaging with the material.
Yeah. No, totally. And I think that's right. So, and interestingly, like this is a digression, but I'm finding readings falling off a cliff. Like even for postgrad people and stuff, I do pretty limited amount of reading. I ask people to do like maybe 4 or 5 page HBR, like Harvard Business Review type articles and stuff. And before people would complain that we're not covering enough material and give me more stuff to memorize and ingest, even only 5 years ago. But now, like I can't get people to engage with that level of information. So I think we're looking at a really fundamental shift in how people engage with knowledge and getting to that domain expertise, like understanding, yeah, he said that, but what about her? And, like to understand the debates. We're losing a bit of that. And there is this sort of necessary friction. Like there's an unpleasant aspect that you have to sort of go through to get to that domain expertise. You have to have stuffed up enough times. You've got to have had enough disasters. And so if we've got this smoothing and sort of generalizing sort of format that we're getting from like LLMs or other sources, it is really interesting that we're not going to be engaging fully, I think, with the kind of with the kind of messiness of learning. So I think it's a real challenge, and one of the things that I found even with doing that activity that I mentioned, like trying to shift it, okay, instead of saying banning AI, we're going to actually steer into it, is that it was really hard to get people to engage in the more critical level. So, often it was this instrumental thing. How do I prompt properly? Or I need to get the output closer to the end use state, not thinking who's it missing out on. So even though I tried to structure and, prompt people around it, a lot of that was really interesting that, getting people to think at that more sophisticated level about, what perspectives are missing, what controversies getting smoothed out, who's sort of what's implied to be like the normal state. So, to make it real, like what I get them to do is actually look at strategic plans of health organizations and say, what do you reckon of it? What's the AI saying? Contrast what's missing. Some of that sort of getting to the what's said and what's unsaid is really important in doing that. And so what's really interesting is the AI is often really compelling and gives a very well-structured, but fundamentally quite thin answer. Like there's often really weak understanding of the context or, what's going on in the organizations or the broader environment. But it's that plausibility thing. And so for people who don't have the mastery of the context, the topic, that sort of stuff, convincing thin descriptions, even if it's not wrong, is often good enough. And so it is an interesting point about how we get to this sort of mastery level of things.
I think this is sort of the conundrum for postgrad and above research, or just postgrad education. Like in the past, we had to grapple with the material because it was the only way you could have a conversation about it. And now, like for my courses that I teach at AGSM, I make them read stuff in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I make sure everybody reads it. I was like, hand out a hard copy in the classroom and say, take some time, read this, and then we're going to discuss it. So that's how I make them grapple with it.
Yeah. And some colleagues do something similar, like this sort of idea of a grounding time where you actually have to engage with the material and then try to contextualize it, make sense of it in real time. There's not necessarily AI shortcuts or other ways of sort of like getting to it. So I think that's the thing is we will probably see different forms emerge. Increasingly, other colleagues are sort of doing things like requiring people to present on material and then sort of interact and sort of workshop stuff as a form of assessment, or even like assessment that's less about outputs and more about process. So more like, portfolio-based stuff or things that describe a process you go through rather than actually fixating on what the end product is. And so I think we'll see bits and pieces of that emerge, and we'll probably end up with something that's a bit of a patchwork across degrees, but it'll take us a while to get there. And I think it'll need to be at the degree level. I think at the tension at the moment, as you probably find in your teaching and work, is you sort of have to figure it out on your own as a sort of teacher, essentially.
Yeah.
Without thinking, how do we get to that like foundational midpoint and then more advanced use across a degree or even across, a program of stuff?
But the thing is that when we construct degrees, how long it takes to get them through the process. And then they were mostly constructed before AI. So we haven't woven AIs through it. We haven't worked out how we're going to use AI in an assessment context. And we really don't have any clarity on those sort of things. So I think there's a lot of thinking. My last guest was a guy called Jason LaGreca, who used to be in Microsoft Education. He's at UTS now. And, he's got really strong opinions that we've got to go back to the old Socratic method. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. But the thing is that education's been democratized really vastly by the availability of online. So I think we want to keep the democratization of access while we work out how to actually make sure that they cover the content in a sensible way.
Yeah, and in a way that sort of produces enduring human skills that aren't necessarily mediated and so on. And I think, it is interesting, like what'll get us to that point. One of the areas of research that I've dug into a bit in trying to understand this is in clinical area where they're sort of introducing things like AI decision aids and so on.
Mm-mm.
Some of the better designed studies that have come along and sort of, yes, these tools can be helpful in sort of, diagnostic or decision-making context, but what's really interesting and under sort of emphasized is how quickly expertise can erode in these sort of uses as well. So I think that's the other bit is like, it's not enough to just learn it once and then sort of forget. You actually need to keep doing, experiencing the friction as well. So what that looks like in practice is really tricky. One of the things that I've become slightly obsessed with, again, trying to understand, using past analogies, is you would have seen all the calculator debates in relation to maths in the sort of 70s to
Oh,
90s,
no,
which,
my father was convinced I was gonna be an idiot because I wasn't gonna be using slide rules and logbooks because I was using a calculator.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, yeah,
And,
I lived it.
who knows? They may be right, but maybe in a few hundred years we'll know. But I think what was really interesting when I dug into that was how entrenched the positions were about it. And that it raged for like a solid 20 years. This was a really live issue in, particularly primary school learning and maths and so on. It's interesting because it comes up all the time as an analogy for what we're experiencing, but it's a flawed one because, calculators are pretty bounded. They can't come up with sort of
Well,
plausible
they're not
seeming wrong answers and stuff.
the thing that I think that we're kind of all dancing around in a way is what we've always assumed to be evidence of intelligence is a certain glibness, certain ability to talk about ideas. And now that AI can do that really convincingly, as you said, slightly thinly often because it doesn't have the depth of understanding, but that's coming.
Totally, yeah.
That
That's right.
is
They
that's
just need
kind
a
of true.
bigger context
So
window and then
yeah,
that'll be there.
yeah. So what do we really mean when we're talking about human intelligence? And then what do we have to do to reshape our education process so that humans can effectively engage with an education process? Because I think the generation that are coming through now are kind of at the stage where they don't see the value in engaging with the process. And I think the thing that you've talked about a fair bit is friction. Because I think friction, we want to remove all the friction from our lives, but that's what teaches us stuff.
Exactly. That's where learning occurs, isn't it? Yeah. And so I think, yeah, and I don't have a good sense of how to sort of give an experience of that. And often in a learning context doesn't necessarily mean, you know, profound personal pain or anything like that, but it is discomfort. You have to sit with discomfort and often try to get somewhere beyond that. It does involve some sort of negative experience and so on. And I think you're right. Like the other thing that maybe we need to sort of consider as part of this is when we consider what intelligence is, there is this sort of glib sense of what it is that, LLMs are particularly good at mimicking, but, increasingly, work from, neuroscience, but other related fields, is telling us that actually human intelligence is not just this embodied thing that sits in our brain or something like that, and that only presents in certain ways. It's it's embodied. Like people, that the act of moving, the act of social interaction, and so on. All those sort of things are ways of understanding a broader model of cognition, and so on, and thinking. And so I think there's a whole dimension to, like, we still don't really understand what we mean when we talk about human intelligence, let alone artificial. And so there's going to be some interesting potential around that. But also, to your point, how do we get um, to something that is very human, process driven, and maybe, engaging with the messiness and the sort of friction, of it all.
Well, so
Uh,
we've already got the first example of very young children saying, "Why do I need to learn to read?" And I've argued that we're on the cusp of a revolution where we're going to transition from typing text into apps to using a generative AI interface that connects through APIs out to a plethora of things. And people are going to start talking to their devices like Star Trek. But we're in the start of that shift, and the kids are already going, "Why do I need to learn to read when my machine will talk to me?" Which means we're moving into a really different kind of paradigm, which I think lends itself to the Socratic method, really.
it does, it does. But also the other thing that's interesting is I've found that one of the best Socratic models is actually LLMs, oddly,
I
like
know.
interaction is a Socratic mode of interaction is really interesting. And I think, to pick up on your point, we probably are at a bit of a turning point where, there's this guy who's quite well known as a writer about this almost 50 years ago, Walter Ong, talking about
Oh,
orality and literacy, the idea
mm.
of the oral tradition being supplanted by a written one as a written technology. But maybe we are at a bit of another transition point, to your point, like where most of our information sharing and so on won't be mediated through written words, or if it is, it's going to be secondary. Maybe the things like, verbal and video kind of interactions. And already you see that, like, who sits down to read a book? How many people sit down and watch endless short form videos? So I think there is something going on in that space.
I think qualitatively, because I love audiobooks, because I can do
Mhm.
other things while I'm listening. Um, and that's a really good way to get through the material. But when I want to think about it, I sit down with, either the paper version or a version on my iPad, with my pen and mark it up. So that's
Yeah.
still how I tend to do it. So
Yeah.
how are we
Same.
going
Yeah.
to engage more fully with the material if it's only in oral form or video form? So I think there's a whole thing we have to think through.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right, and it really is quite, foundational. It's like, what is what is human intelligence? How does learning actually feature into that in a broader sense, like a broader conceptualization of learning? Do we need to have some of these things? Like for example, there's a lot of people because of specific learning disabilities or neurodiversity. Like writing and reading is a real barrier to entry, and so like alternatives to that would be potentially quite freeing. However, are there just some aspects of that that we really do need to preserve? So I think it's going to be it's a profoundly tricky time when we think about that at a sort of broader epistemological level. Like how do we know what we know? But also then, even just thinking at a more keeping society ticking along and the role of learning and education in that, how are we going to make sure that the human role becomes pretty central to that? It's not like an adjunct to a lot of these things, that we're not just trying to develop skills as instrumental checklists, but there's a broader recognition of the values of sort of friction, messiness, directionless learning and thought as well, because I think that is some of the distinctive things that come out of human thinking and human creativity, but it's not necessarily something that's valued. So,
It's really interesting because I've worked in both the higher education space and the technical and further education
mm,
space.
mm,
And in the TAFE space, you are literally doing adult education, which is different to higher education. So
definitely. Yeah.
we use a kind of different set of principles there. We do things like spaced repetition. So we talk about them, present the material, come back to it, present it in different ways. So we would use, video and audio and written stuff, and how we kind of wove it together in adult education space. And I don't think that's part of the culture of higher education, because they're really chalk and talk. It's a chalk and talk operation, slightly more
It's true.
PowerPoint and talk presentation now, but it was basically born out of the blackboard. So people
Yeah.
writing on a blackboard
Yeah.
and talking about stuff, and then having the people have engaged with the written content before the lecture. So
Yeah.
how we're going to need to shift that mode of education to the new world is a really interesting challenge.
And it is interesting, and it's interesting that a lot of the genuine innovation I'm seeing in pedagogy in terms of the adoption of AI is actually more in the vet sector. So, for example, I was um, watching this sort of video presentation and interview with some guys who are using it as part of teaching mechanics now. So sort of using AI as part of customer service sims, and also like more advanced diagnostic sort of stuff, like checking problem solving ability in a pretty applied way. Spaced repetition, like you said, that's a bit more bespoke, that actually recognizes you might have got this, might need to come back to this. So
Yes,
I think
really
there's a lot of
interesting stuff
really exciting things. Yeah.
in mechanics where they've got augmented reality so that, like they don't have to have a million parts, but people can go into the augmented reality and pick the right part for the job without needing to have the physical item. So it's
Yeah.
really, really some interesting stuff in the vet space. But
Yeah.
the different sectors need to start to talk together, I think.
I think that's true. Yeah. And exactly. And I think that's like as usual as a chalk and talk operation in higher ed, we're tending to worry too much about the abstract, how to make better human decision making and stuff like that, where that's actually engaging with the thing about how do we get you to sort of like practical mastery of something. How do we get you to know what you can do? And then we can worry about the next sort of more layer of abstraction on that, about, how to make sure that the human validation and so on is part of more automated processes and so on. So I do think there's heaps of stuff. And I say that as someone who went to TAFE myself first. And, that it is actually how you get the foundational level of understanding and grounding on which you can muck around with. That lets you do stuff and then reflect and learn from there.
The other thing that a lot of people are talking to me about, like I taught my AI innovation course last week, and a lot of the conversation in the breaks was about jobs and, what jobs are going to disappear. And I was like, but new jobs will emerge. Like it happens with every technology revolution, like huge swathes of jobs go, but new ones emerge. And we need to start thinking about the new ones. And I think a lot of the new ones are really about how do we have proper human oversight, and how do we keep proper human agency in the
Yes.
process, so that
Yeah.
the AIs aren't designing stuff completely on their own. How do we
Yeah,
set
I think that's
guardrails for them? All of those things.
yeah. Well, I think that's totally right, and that's why I've been a bit motivated to try and actively do something about it, because I think from my perspective, the health sectors for a lot of this stuff can be a bit of a canary in the coal mine, because the stakes are so visible and immediate. There's often been this widespread and pretty uncritical adoption of AI scribes in like general practice or private
Oh my God. My vet asked
specialists.
me if they could use it for my dog's recent visit. I was like, sure.
I haven't heard of that before. That is
No, it says,
fantastic.
and it's the same one my doctor's using. So the vet's using the same application for AI as my doctor. It's just, oh my God.
Fantastic. Fantastic. That is great. I'll steal that if that's all right. That's a fantastic. But, I think we can see that there's lots of potential there for uncritical adoption, de-skilling, algorithmic bias, all those sort of things. So I think that's why I'm kind of a bit animated about it, because the stakes are pretty real and pretty, they're happening now.
Well, we've,
But,
we've already got cases, where people of color are being discriminated against because the health data doesn't have anybody except white men in it, doesn't even have women
yeah,
in it. So a lot of the
exactly.
decisions are made on men's body weights, not incorporating women,
Yep.
not let
Yeah,
alone people of color. So, there is a lot of bias in health data.
that's right. And Robojet is sort of the original. I mean, it's not AI. That was sort of a relatively unsophisticated algorithm, but it's sort of the thing I keep coming back to in like public administration and organizational like oversight. It really is just how unsophisticated adoption of, again, unsophisticated approaches based on flawed data, flawed assumptions, really just had this massive, widespread negative harm. And it's the perfect sort of scapegoat as well, because it means no one's on the hook for it as well.
Yeah.
So,
But this is where human accountability and oversight comes in. So, we need to start
absolutely.
to think about what does that look like meaningfully. One of the interesting things that's kind of emerging in the agentic space is this idea of you have an agent, and then you have an observer agent, and then you have an assurance agent. So you have like the 3 agent roles working together, so that you can say, it's working the way it's meant to, and that it's still valid.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's sort of, I mean, it's kind of wacky in a sense, but I think it does try to recognize at the agent level that, that's what a lot of things happen in organizations. You've got your managers who
The same
provide
thing
the
was with new
oversight. You've
people.
got your boards or your governance to provide assurance, So is it trying to get at the same approach in sort of an AI sense? I think that is kind of interesting, and often, look, to be honest, in doing these reviews of strategic plans, one of the things that's really fascinating to get AIs to do is to say, come up with some critiques. One of the best prompts I've found is actually rewrite the strategy to address those critiques. And what they come up with, if they implement it, would be kind of revolutionary, because we might actually get rid of all the fluff that makes up strategy and start doing some of the things that we might need to do. So it'd be really interesting to see what's coming out of that and how we build humans into that kind of tripartite arrangement or something like that.
Yeah. Well, it's really funny. So for my one of my masters, the one that I finished in 2019, just before COVID hit,
Uh,
I did a review of all of the universities in Australia's strategies, and they are all the same. They all have the same strategy, all done by different consultants firms, but they are literally the same strategy.
exactly.
And and it was about digital transformation in Australian higher ed, and I came to the conclusion
Transformation, ensuring excellence, national
yeah,
competitiveness.
academic excellence,
Yes, yes.
social impact, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so everyone's got the same uh, strategy. So the interesting thing in the education space is there's no one thinking about how am I different to everybody else.
Exactly. What's my unique value
Yeah,
proposition and so on?
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
all of
Why
those
would you
things that
come
we
here
teach in
instead
business
of,
school.
flat world of education? Why would I go here instead of, Harvard Online or this or that, Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I
totally.
don't
Yeah.
think they've kind of grappled with the idea that you can go anywhere online now. So why would you schlep to a place?
Yeah. And because I can go anywhere online and because of, the vagaries of costs and exchange rates and stuff, you can probably go to some, very flash impressive place. So I think you're 100% right. Everyone's trying to sort of compete through sameness rather than actually distinctiveness. So I think in terms of, you were mentioning, essentially economic transformation, workforce transformation and so on. Who's positioning for that, it's really
It was really interesting. I was in a meeting this morning where we were talking about that, sort of like what skills does Australia need to position itself for? How can Australia think about being competitive globally in the world of AI? What do we mean by sovereign AI? All of these really important questions. People are starting to think about this. But some
yeah.
of the stuff is, we need to imagine a future where the corporation is no longer just people. So the corporation might be people and AIs. And I've got a couple of friends in America who report to AI. They have AI
Wow.
managers. And it kind of does my head in. One
Yeah.
of them hates it and one of them doesn't care. But
Yeah.
it's kind of one of the futures for a lot of us is that we will report to AIs and, because they can do scheduling just as well as the next human, probably better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as usual, it's often the sort of more low status, vulnerable workers who are already experiencing the future, like I might say that like, wow. And then I think, oh, well, an Uber Eats delivery rider, like they've been doing that for a while now. So effectively, so I
They've
think
already got
there's,
robots in China. So, but I think the interesting thing now is nobody cares when it's those people losing their jobs. When it's white collar people losing their jobs, everybody loses their minds. And the
yes,
fact
that's
that,
now it's personal. Yeah.
there's a whole lot of white collar jobs starting to go.
You go. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
but I think it's really interesting what your approach is. And was really interested to have that conversation because I just think I think it's worthwhile thinking about these things from an education perspective, because I really think education has an important role into the future. And we need to, if we're not thinking about these things, we'll never get there.
Exactly. Yeah. And we'll always be playing catch up. And I think that's going to be necessary just because of the pace of change during this transition. But unless we try and get slightly ahead of the curve, um, the transition will be a lot more destabilizing than it probably needs to be.
Yeah. Well, what are your final thoughts?
Look, my final thoughts are probably, essentially I'm not anti-AI, but I think it is a technology that's genuinely useful and genuinely here anyway. So like you got to live with it. Um, And I think the most dangerous response is going to be uncritical adoption, like not thinking about how this is going to play out, not thinking how you can position for this and so on. And that my goal isn't necessarily, to be a booster for it or an opponent, but I think getting to that more critical awareness and engagement is going to be really important. And if we're not engendering that in other people, um, there's going to be a lot of people who miss out.
That is some really good thoughts. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Lovely to chat, Kate. Good to see you.